I've been taking a lot of sunset photos recently, and I'm going to run through the approach I'm taking to editing them in Lightroom. So I've got lots of sunset photos here that I've taken over the last month, and I'm going to choose this one to work on. So I'm going to create a new copy and I'm going to reset the edit. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to straighten the horizon and sort the crop out. Function F6 to hide the camera roll, and then R to go into the crop tool. And then I am going to zoom in slightly to make it easier to see. So then hit Command, that brings up the ruler, and then I can just drag across the bit that I want to be level, and then that's going to automatically adjust it. I now want to, there we go, press Z to zoom out slightly, and then I'm just going to bring the crop in to here. I just want to center the sun horizontally. This probably wouldn't be the final crop I'd use for this photo, but for this example it's fine. So then press R again to come out of the crop tool, and that's our starting point. So the approach I've been taking is to use these sort of modular presets that I'm building up. And the idea is I can pick and choose which ones I want to apply to a particular photo. They're a work in progress and I will be adding more, but for now, these are the basics. Something that is immediately obvious with this photo is the strong contrast between the brightness of the sun and then the darkness of the foreground and the beach and the sea here. So the first one of these presets aims to correct for that. So I'm going to apply that, and you can see that's really brought up the shadows and dropped down some of the highs in the sky and the sun. So if you look at what it's doing, it's dropping the highlights, raising shadows and blacks, all the way for the shadows and blacks. And then with the tone curve, I'm applying this kind of curve. If I just show you what it looks like without that, that's that. And in fact, I can do that here. So without that. So this curve, I'm adding a slight fade. I'm kind of really liking that look at the moment. And then I think the other thing it's doing is, if I can find it, it's adding a very slight vignette, which I think works with this sort of photo with a very prominent central subject. So for the next step, I've been experimenting a lot with the RGB curves, so doing a sort of color grade using those. And if I apply, let's just apply this first one. And what this is doing is it's adding a couple of masks. So I'm using the luminance range, selecting the entire photo, so the whole thing is masked. What this is doing in the red channel, it's just a very shallow S-curve, which is dropping into the sort of cyans in the shadows and then raising the reds in the highlights. And then the blue one, I've called it reverse because I'm raising the shadows and lowering the highlights. So that's pushing the shadows slightly more blue and pushing the highlights slightly more yellow. And then it's the combination of those together, which is producing the effect. So we go from that to that. And then if I want to show this other one, I'm going to have to undo that and then apply this one. And this is using the red and green channels. So the red, same as before, and then the green one. So we're adding slight magenta to the shadows and slight green to the highlights. So that's it without, and that's it with. And then all I do when I'm editing the photos is I can just hover over these and decide which one I like the look of most. And I think for this photo, definitely prefer that one. I'll also show you this, which helped me get to these two presets here. So I'm going to undo that one. And then I'm just going to apply this one, Curves RGB. And all that does is that adds a load of disabled layer masks, which are essentially what I've just shown you using the RGB curve here. But I've done one for each of the three channels and then the reverse for each of the three channels. So I can just go through and see how each of them affects the photo, to work out if I like the look of any of them. And then of course you can combine them. And if you wanted, you could make these much more extreme, the curves. But for now, I'm just, I mean, that obviously looks horrible, but so I'm just using these fairly subtle curves, but they do produce an interesting color grading effect. Okay, I'm going to reapply this preset, and then I'm going to apply this one as well. And what this one does is it just adds a couple of linear gradient masks, one to the top and one to the bottom. I wish I'd placed these the other way around. Oh well, I'll adjust that another time. So, and all they're doing, if I pick the C first, I can just change that. And that is just a linear gradient top to bottom. And then it just applies a slight curve or reduction in the mid-tones. And then I'm going to do the same with the sky. That just does more or less the same to slightly less effect. And I've reduced the saturation. I quite often do that with curves. That can, if you don't reduce the saturation, sometimes it can increase it way more than you would want it to. And this is a sort of technique I use a lot, especially with vertical images. If you've got a central subject, it can really help to draw your eye to the center of the image. So that's the process at the moment. I guess what wasn't obvious is that depending on the photo, I will need to adjust some of these settings. I don't just apply the preset and leave it at that. I think the next steps, I'll take the vignette out of that base preset and maybe make 2 or 3 vignette presets of varying strength, so I can choose whether to apply one at all and how strong I want it to be. Okay, hopefully you found something interesting or useful in there.